I never imagined that the land my grandfather bled for, the same soil where my father taught me how to ride horses and drive fence posts, the very acreage that had been passed down through 3 generations of my family, would one day be stolen from me. Not by strangers from across the country or some slick corporate developer, but by a pack of petty tyrants who called themselves the Homeowners Association. My 1,500 acres of wild pastures, pine groves, and rolling hills weren't just dirt and timber. They were my family's story carved into the earth, a place where every ridge and creek had a name, where the air carried the smell of cattle after a storm and the echo of my father's voice, teaching me what stewardship meant. To me, it wasn't just land. It was heritage. But to the HOA board, it was a gold mine, a chess piece they thought they could move around with forged documents and fraudulent claims, believing I was too blind, too trusting, or too weak to fight back. And for a moment, maybe they were right. The day I received the notice that my acreage had been transferred through what they called a routine adjustment in property lines, my chest caved in as though I'd been kicked by a mule. I stood on my porch, hands trembling as I read the legal jargon, the county's seal at the bottom, and the signature of a clerk who I knew had been in the HOA's pocket for years. At first, I thought it was a mistake. How could 1,500 acres, the majority of my property, suddenly belong to them? It didn't make sense. My grandfather's name was still on the original deed, and mine was etched in ink as his heir. But when I called the county office, they treated me like some crank calling, about a misunderstanding. The transfer was recorded legally, the clerk said, her voice flat and practiced, as though she'd been repeating the same lie all day. If you have an issue, you'll need to take it up in civil court. Civil court. I knew exactly what that meant. Months, if not years, of red tape while the HOA bulldozed my land, sold parcels, and fattened their bank accounts. By the time any court recognized my claim, there'd be nothing left to fight for. That night, I walked the fence line by lantern light, staring at the expanse of grass that stretched beyond the horizon, trying to make sense of it all. Coyotes howled in the distance, the same way they had when I was a boy. But the sound, no longer felt like a reminder of wilderness. It sounded like morning. I could almost see my father's face in the shadows, the disappointment etched into his eyes, the weight of a legacy lost because I hadn't been vigilant enough. But as the rage bubbled up, hot and suffocating, I knew one thing. This wasn't the end of the story. If the HOA thought they could steal from me without consequence, they had no idea who they were dealing with. The betrayal ran deeper than just paperwork. I'd known many of those HOA board members for years, people who had waved at me while driving their SUVs past my pastures, people who brought over cheap wine during community barbecues, smiling like friends while secretly plotting to gut me of the very thing that defined me. There was Karen, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, who wore pearls to meetings as though she were royalty presiding over a kingdom, her eyes always calculating, sharp as broken glass. She had been whispering for years about rezoning opportunities and shared community assets, which I dismissed as idle talk, never believing she'd have the gall to target my land directly. Then there was Mark, the vice president, a former real estate agent whose entire personality revolved around the smell of money and the sound of flipping property titles. Together, they schemed to turn my acres into their empire. They weren't after farmland or woods. They were after the lakefront, the jewel of the property, where the water shimmered like liquid silver at sunrise. My grandfather had stocked that lake himself, hauling in catfish fingerlings from 3 counties over, and I had spent my boyhood summers fishing from its banks, watching the water ripple under the oaks. That lake wasn't just valuable, it was sacred. And they knew it. They knew developers would pay millions to put mansions around its shores, turning a place of solitude into a playground for the rich. That was their plan all along, to seize my land, build their luxury homes, and cash in. The first bulldozer came 2 weeks after the notice, rumbling down the dirt road with its blade raised like a weapon. I stood in its path, shotgun slung over my shoulder, and stared down the operator. He refused to look me in the eye, just handed me a folded paper, an injunction signed by a judge who I knew played golf with Karen's husband every Saturday morning. It was official. They had the right to develop. I felt my knees buckle, but I didn't back down. I walked those acres every day, watching surveyors hammer stakes into the soil, men in suits pointing at maps and contractors spraying. Neon lines across grass that had never been cut by anything but cattle hooves. The worst part wasn't the loss itself, it was the smugness. The way HOA board members smirked when they drove by, as if to say, "You're finished." They underestimated me, though. They mistook silence for defeat, patience for surrender. What they didn't know was that I had already begun digging, calling in favors from old friends, scouring courthouse basements for records, piecing together a history they thought was buried. If they believed my land was theirs, then they were, about to learn what it meant to fight someone with nothing left to lose. But before I could strike back, I had to face the reality of what they had already taken. One evening, I drove my truck to the highest ridge overlooking the lake. The sun was setting, painting the water in fire and gold, and I thought about how many generations had watched that same sunset from this very hill. My grandfather had built a bench there out of rough cedar, and though it was worn and splintered now, I sat on it like he used to, breathing the air that still smelled like pine and rain. I let myself grieve, not just for the land, but for the arrogance of people who thought heritage could be bought and sold like stock. Tears burned in my eyes, but beneath the sorrow was a furnace of rage. If they wanted a war, then a war they would get. The thing about corruption is that it always leaves a trail, no matter how careful the thieves believe themselves to be. And the deeper I dug into the paperwork, the more careless fingerprints of greed I found smeared across the history of my land. For weeks, I practically lived in the archives of the county courthouse, down in a basement that smelled of mold and old ink, flipping through records so fragile they threatened to disintegrate at my touch. Clerks and interns gave me sideways glances, probably wondering why a man who looked like a rancher, boots caked with mud, shirt smelling faintly of smoke from my wood stove, spent hours hunched over property plats and notarized forms. But I didn't care. I wasn't there to impress anyone. I was there to find proof that the HOA had lied, cheated, and stolen from me. And piece by piece, the picture came into focus. At first, it was small things, dates that didn't align, survey maps that shifted boundaries by a fraction of an acre, signatures that seemed too precise, too rehearsed. Most people wouldn't have noticed. But I grew up watching my father balance books in the evenings, and I learned early on that details tell the truth. By the second week, I had already uncovered one anomaly so glaring it nearly knocked me off. My chair. The deed transferring 1/500 acres from me to the HOA was recorded on a day the county offices were officially closed for renovations. How could a clerk process a deed when the entire building was shut down? It was sloppy, arrogant, the kind of mistake people make when they think no one is watching. And as I tucked that document into my growing folder of evidence, I felt the first stirrings of hope. Still, I knew I couldn't fight this battle alone. I needed allies. Late one night, as the wind howled outside my cabin and the lake shimmered under the moon, I called my old friend Daniel, a lawyer who had once been known as the bulldog of the state. Daniel and I had gone to high school together before. Life pulled us in different directions. Me to the land, him to the city, where he built a reputation as a man who could sniff out fraud like a bloodhound. He picked up on the second ring, his voice groggy. "Do you have any idea what time it is?" he grumbled. I told him I needed his help, told him what had happened, told him how the HOA had stolen my family's legacy. For a long moment, there was silence on the other end of the line. Then he sighed and said, "I'll be there in the morning." True to his word, Daniel rolled up the next day in a dusty black sedan, his tie crooked, his briefcase already half open, papers spilling out. We sat at my kitchen table while I laid out everything I had found: the forged signatures, the impossible filing dates, the dead notary's seal. He listened without interrupting, his eyes narrowing as he pieced together the puzzle. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and said, "They've been sloppy. Sloppy enough that if we play this right, we can not only prove fraud, but burn them so badly they'll wish they'd never heard your name." Hearing those words lit a fire in me. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like maybe, just maybe, I could win. But winning wouldn't be easy. The HOA wasn't just a group of nosy neighbors and self-important board members. They were connected. They had judges who owed them favors, clerks in their pockets, developers lined up like vultures waiting for the carcass. Every move I made would have to be precise, calculated. One wrong step, and they'd bury me in so much litigation I'd be broke before I set foot in a courtroom. Daniel knew this too. "We need more than paperwork," he said, tapping his pen against the table. "We need witnesses, people who will testify, someone from inside." That idea seemed impossible. The HOA board was tight-knit, a little cabal that operated like a cartel, rewarding loyalty and punishing dissent. But Daniel was right. Paper could be explained away, twisted by lawyers until black looked like white. A human voice, though a whistleblower, could change everything. The first crack in their armor came from an unlikely place: a retired surveyor named Bill Jensen. Bill was an old-timer who had worked in the county for decades, the kind of man who knew every creek bed and tree line better than the maps themselves. He lived in a sagging farmhouse at the edge of town, and when I knocked on his door, he looked me up and down with suspicion. "What do you want?" he barked, his voice gravelly from years of smoking. I explained who I was, told him about the stolen acres, told him about the surveys that didn't match. He frowned, disappeared inside, and returned with a dusty box. "I knew this day would come," he muttered. Inside the box were old maps, hand-drawn, annotated with notes in the margins, his notes. And as we spread them across his kitchen table, the truth became undeniable. The HOA's revised boundaries didn't just shift by accident. They had been deliberately redrawn to swallow my land. Bill jabbed a finger at one map. "This here line," he said, "never moved in. 50 years. But look at theirs. It cuts right across your pasture. It's a lie." My chest tightened as I realized the depth of their scheme. They hadn't just stolen land, they had rewritten history to make it look like it was theirs all along. Bill agreed to testify if it came to court. "I ain't afraid of those clowns," he said, lighting another cigarette. "They've been cheating people for years. Time someone stood up to them. With Bill on our side and Daniel digging deeper into the county's corruption, we started to assemble a case. But the HOA must have sensed what we were up to because soon the pressure began. First, it was fines. Letters claiming I owed thousands for non-compliant structures on land I supposedly didn't even own anymore. Then came the harassment, anonymous. Calls in the middle of the night, headlights parked at the end of my driveway, drones buzzing over my roof. Karen herself cornered me at the general store one morning, her lips curled in a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You should stop this foolishness," she whispered, close enough that I could smell her expensive perfume. "The land is gone. Fighting us will only ruin you." I stared at her, feeling the weight of generations behind me, and said, "You have no idea what you've started." Her smile faltered just a fraction, and I knew then that we were beginning to scare them. Fear, I realized, was a powerful weapon. The more they tried to intimidate me, the harder I pushed. Nights turned into mornings as I combed through files, comparing signatures, tracing ownership chains. And that's when I found it. The overlooked easement buried in the original deed, granting my family perpetual control of shoreline access and adjoining lots. It was the kind of clause developers hated, a tiny legal tripwire that could derail million-dollar projects. I remember the exact moment I understood what it meant. Not only did I still have legal rights to the land, but if the HOA had already started building their luxury lakefront mansions, those properties might technically sit on ground I still controlled. The thought hit me like lightning. They had stolen my 2,500 acres, but in their haste, they had built their dreams on my foundation. And that foundation could collapse with a single legal blow. As Daniel examined the easement, his grin grew wider. "Do you understand what this means?" he asked. I nodded, my heart pounding. "It means their empire sits on my land." He leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. "It means when the time is right, we won't just take back your property. We'll own theirs." In that moment, I realized the tide had turned. They thought they had stolen everything. The first time I walked into the courthouse to face the HOA, I could feel every eye in the room on me, as though I were some stubborn relic refusing to bow to the new order. Karen sat at the front of the courtroom, pearls gleaming under the fluorescent lights, her posture so rigid it looked rehearsed. Beside her was Mark, flipping through papers with the smug expression of a man who thought he had already won. Behind them, the rest of the board sat like vultures in tailored suits, whispering and smirking as though they were about to witness my execution. But I wasn't walking into a slaughter. I was walking into a battlefield I had chosen, armed, with truths they never thought would see the light of day. Daniel strode beside me, his tie straight this time, his briefcase bursting with evidence. As we sat down at the plaintiff's table, he leaned toward me and whispered, "Remember, this is their first real taste of fear. Don't give them a reason to think you'll back down." I nodded, though my hands were trembling under the table. This was no longer just about land. It was about dignity, legacy, and teaching those people what it meant to pick a fight with someone they couldn't bully into submission. The opening arguments played out like theater. Their lawyer, a slick man with a silver tongue and a reputation for burying opponents in legal jargon, stood before the judge and declared that I was a bitter landowner clinging to technicalities, that the HOA had acted in the best interest of the community, and that my accusations of fraud were baseless conspiracy theories. His voice dripped with arrogance, his words polished like glass marbles that sparkled but carried no weight. When he sat down, Karen smirked, certain they had already poisoned the judge's perception. Then Daniel stood. His voice wasn't polished. It was sharp, deliberate, every word like a hammer striking steel. He laid out the basics, not the fireworks, not yet, just the foundation. He spoke of deeds filed on impossible dates, of signatures notarized by dead men, of survey lines that shifted like sand in a storm. He didn't accuse, he demonstrated. He didn't shout. He pressed forward with the calm authority of someone who knew the truth was on his side. By the time he sat down, I could see the smirk on Karen's lips twitch. They weren't as invincible as they thought. What followed was months of war, fought not with bullets but with motions, depositions, and hearings. The HOA used every trick in the book to delay, to exhaust me, to bleed me dry. They filed countersuits, claiming I had harassed their members, that I had threatened contractors, that I was endangering community harmony. They subpoenaed my financial records, my phone calls, even my emails, desperate to find anything they could use to discredit me. There were nights I lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if they'd succeed, if I'd drown under the weight of their money and influence. But every time doubt crept in, I remembered the look on Karen's face when Daniel laid out that first piece of evidence. Fear. She could disguise it behind arrogance, but it was there, and fear meant weakness. We began to build momentum. Bill Jensen, the retired surveyor, took the stand during one preliminary hearing, his hands shaking but his voice steady as he pointed out the fraudulent maps. "That line doesn't belong there," he said, jabbing his finger at the HOA's survey. It never did. They knew it, and they drew it anyway. The courtroom was silent, every word landing like a hammer blow. Next came a former county clerk, pressured by Daniel's relentless cross-examination, who admitted under oath that she had been encouraged by certain board members to fast-track property transfers. When asked if she received anything, in return she hesitated just long enough to damn herself. The judge's brow furrowed. The HOA's lawyer scrambled to object, but the damage was done. Brick by brick, their fortress was crumbling. Of course, they didn't take it lying down. The harassment escalated. My truck was vandalized in a grocery store parking lot, its windows smashed, the word traitor spray-painted across the hood. Dead animals began appearing on my property line, first a raccoon, then a dog, placed deliberately where I would find them. Late at night, my phone would buzz with anonymous messages. You can't win. Sell out now before it's too late. Accidents happen. I kept the messages, handed them to Daniel, who added them to our growing file of evidence. Each threat, each smear, each act of cowardice only fueled my determination. They wanted me to break. Instead, they sharpened me into steel. The turning point came when Daniel unveiled the ace we'd been holding close, the easement buried in the original deed. In a packed courtroom, he produced the faded document, carefully unrolling it like a relic. This, he declared, his voice echoing off the walls, is a perpetual easement granting my client control over not only access to the shoreline, but any development built upon it. He paused, letting the words sink in. Karen shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her pearls clinking against each other. Which means, Daniel continued, his eyes locked on the judge, that every single one of the multi-million-dollar mansions the HOA has approved and constructed along this lake is, in fact, built on land that my client retains legal authority over. The room erupted. Gasps echoed through the gallery, whispers darted back and forth like sparks. Even the judge leaned forward, adjusting his glasses to read the document more closely. The HOA's lawyer stammered, scrambling to object, but his words faltered. The trap had sprung, and they hadn't even seen it coming. The weeks that followed were chaos. Developers who had invested millions in the lakefront homes suddenly realized their titles were worthless. Banks began calling in loans. Buyers backed out of contracts. The HOA scrambled, holding emergency meetings, their once proud empire cracking, under the weight of a single overlooked clause. Karen tried to spin it, claiming the easement was outdated, irrelevant, unenforceable. But Daniel tore her arguments apart piece by piece, citing precedent after precedent, showing case after case where easements like this had not only been enforced, but had toppled developments larger than theirs. The more they fought, the deeper they sank. And as the walls closed in, their arrogance began to slip. Mark, once so smug, looked pale and shaken during hearings. Other board members avoided my gaze entirely, their confidence evaporating like mist. But victory wasn't enough. I didn't just want them to lose. I wanted them to feel the same helplessness, the same humiliation, the same crushing realization I had felt the day I stood on my porch and read that fraudulent notice. And as the legal gears ground forward, I realized I had the power to do exactly that. Because the easement didn't just give me authority over the land, it gave me the right to liquidate assets tied to it. In other words, the very mansions they had built as monuments to their greed could be sold off, legally, right out from under them. When Daniel explained it to me, my heart pounded so hard I thought it might break my ribs. They stole your acres, he said, his grin feral. Now you'll take their millions. For the first time in months, I laughed. A deep, genuine laugh that echoed through my empty kitchen, shaking off the shadows that had haunted me. This wasn't just justice. This was revenge carved into law, signed and sealed with the arrogance of my enemies. And so drew to its close, I stood once again on the ridge overlooking the lake, the mansions gleaming in the sunset like fragile glass palaces. Only now, when I looked at them, I didn't see loss. I saw spoils. I saw a future where those homes, once symbols of betrayal, would be the instruments of my triumph. The HOA had stolen from me, but in their greed, they had built their empire on my foundation. And soon I would pull that foundation out from under them. Soon the same people who had smirked as they stole my heritage would watch in horror as I legally sold every last one of their million-dollar dreams. When the gavel finally came down in my favor, the sound reverberated through the courtroom like thunder rolling across the hills of my land, a sound that carried not just the weight of victory, but the collapse of an empire built on arrogance and greed. Karen's face drained of color as the judge ruled that the easement was valid, enforceable, and binding, granting me full control over the shoreline and the properties tied to it. The rest of the HOA board sat in stunned silence, their suits suddenly looking like costumes on actors who had forgotten their lines, their smug grins erased and replaced with slack-jawed disbelief. I wanted to savor the moment, but I knew this was only the beginning. The judgment didn't just restore what had been stolen from me. It handed me the keys to their mansions, those gleaming million-dollar symbols of their hubris, and gave me the legal right to do what they had done to me, sell them off one by one until nothing of their empire remained. As we walked out of the courthouse, reporters swarmed, their cameras flashing, microphones shoved in my face, asking how it felt to take down the HOA that had once ruled the lakefront like dictators. I gave them no victory speech, no triumphant declaration. I simply said, "Justice," and walked past them into the sunlight, where Daniel clapped me on the back and whispered, "Now it's time to make them feel it." The sale began quietly, almost unceremoniously. A notice went out to the HOA and the homeowners. Their properties, built on land controlled by my family's easement, were being liquidated to satisfy damages and reclaim losses. At first they laughed, thinking it was some empty threat, another legal maneuver that could be stalled with paperwork. But then came the first auction. A sprawling mansion worth nearly $2 million, perched high above the lake with glass walls that shimmered in the morning light, was listed under my name. Bidders crowded into the courthouse steps, developers elbowing one another for a chance at prime waterfront property. And when the gavel struck, the house was gone, sold to a man from out of state who had no ties to the HOA, no loyalty to its board, no reason to care about their misery. I watched Karen arrive too late to stop it. Her face twisted with rage as she realized this wasn't a bluff, it was real, and it was only the beginning. By the end of that week, 3 more mansions had been sold, their owners forced to pack boxes, their luxury cars loaded with belongings, their dreams shattered in the span of days. Every time a moving truck rolled past the gates, I stood on my ridge and watched, not with cruelty, but with the cold satisfaction of knowing they were tasting the same helplessness they had forced upon me. The community turned on itself like wolves fighting over scraps. Neighbors who once attended cocktail parties together now screamed in each other's faces, blaming Karen and the board for their downfall. Lawsuits flew not at me, but at them. Homeowners suing the very association that had promised to protect their investments. The once pristine streets of their gated paradise grew tense and hostile, for sale signs sprouting like weeds as panic set in. And still the auctions continued. Each week, another mansion went under the gavel, the proceeds wired into accounts tied to my family's claim. With every sale, the HOA shrank, its influence reduced to rubble, its power eroded like cliffs against a relentless tide. Karen fought tooth and nail, filing emergency motions, appealing to higher courts, even rallying the local news to paint me as a heartless tyrant destroying families. But no amount of spin could erase the simple truth. They had stolen from me, and I had merely taken back what was mine, with interest. Her once commanding presence crumbled under the weight of humiliation. At one particularly heated meeting, recorded by a furious homeowner, Karen broke down in tears, her voice cracking as she tried to explain how unforeseen technicalities had led to this disaster. The video went viral in the county, her fall, from grace complete. The day Karen's own mansion went on the block was the sweetest of all. The lakefront palace she had boasted about for years, the one where she hosted her soirees, the one where she had sneered at me across the property line, was now mine to sell. I didn't attend the auction in person. I didn't need to. I sat on the cedar bench my grandfather had built on the ridge, the same bench where I had once wept at the thought of losing everything, and I listened to the echo of the gavel through the live stream. "Sold!" the auctioneer cried, and just like that, Karen was homeless. I imagined her clutching those pearls, the symbol of her false royalty, as movers hauled her furniture out the front door, past the same manicured hedges she once lorded over. It wasn't cruelty that brought me joy. It was justice. Pure, unshakable justice, as natural as the tide reclaiming the sand. By the time the final mansion was sold, the lakefront had changed forever. No longer a playground for the arrogant. Elite, it became a patchwork of new owners, families, retirees, developers who actually respected the land instead of exploiting it. The HOA was dissolved, bankrupt, its board scattered like leaves in the wind. Karen moved 3 counties over, her name whispered in disgrace, while Mark vanished from public life entirely, his real estate career reduced to ashes. And me? I stood on my ridge, watching the sunset over the lake, the same lake my grandfather had stocked with catfish, the same lake my father had taught me to fish. My land was mine again, my legacy intact. But more than that, I had proven something. They never understood. That land isn't just dirt and water. It's history. It's roots. It's the heartbeat of those who came before. You can't steal that with signatures or bulldozers. You can't erase it with lies. And if you try, if you dare to take what was never yours, then one day you'll find yourself standing on the other side of an auction block, watching everything you built slip through your fingers. As I sat on that bench, the night air cooling, against my skin, I felt the weight of the battle finally lift. The coyotes howled again in the distance, not mournful this time, but triumphant, as though they too knew the land had been restored to its rightful hands. I closed my eyes, breathed deep, and whispered to my grandfather's memory, to my father's spirit, to the generations that would follow. It's ours again, and no one will ever take it from us. The lake shimmered in the moonlight, unbroken, eternal, reflecting not just the stars above, but the truth carved into its waters. Greed may rise like a storm, but justice, like the land itself, endures.